Do you think it is a reasonable understanding of what is happening in the world today to speak of a decline, of an end, if you like, of the U.S. empire in the world, the one that basically came into its modern form after World War II? Something like the decline of the Roman or Greek or British Empire. Is that a reasonable understanding from your perspective?
Well, over a long stretch, the U.S. domination of the world has, of course, declined. It hit its peak, as you said, at the end of World War II. At that point, the United States had a position of global power that had no remote analog in human history. U.S. controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. Other industrial powers had been devastated by the war. The United States gained enormously economically through the war. Manufacturing production practically quadrupled. It had maybe 40, 50% of world's wealth. Nothing like that in history. Obviously couldn't last forever. In fact, within a couple of years, it declined. 1949, China became independent, what's called in the United States the loss of China. The terminology expresses the conception of how the world is supposed to be run. After that, industrial powers reconstituted themselves. The third world began to decolonize. You got the non-aligned movement. By about, say, 1970, the world was what's called tripolar. Major center in North America based on the United States, in Europe based on Germany mainly, and in Asia at that point based mainly on Japan. Since then, other changes have taken place. Collapse of the Soviet Union gave a short period of euphoria in the United States. We can take over the world again. Of course, that couldn't last. We're now in a period where the analogy to the Roman Empire is not completely wrong. As in the case of Rome, the United States is under severe attack from within. The society is collapsing from within in many ways. Internationally, it has overwhelming power. So in the military dimension, no combination of states is even close. In other what's called soft power, like trade, commercial relations, and so on, it's being overcome by China. The United States is trying to hold it back, but doesn't know how to do it. You can't overcome economic development, infrastructure building, loans, and so on with bombs. So China's constructing this enormous Eurasian system. The Belt and Road Initiative includes India, Pakistan, Russia. It's extending to Africa, where China's now the main, has the major trade relations, even to Latin America, the United States backdoor. All the United States can do in response to this is use its comparative advantage in military force. So the U.S. is now constructing what's called a ring of what are called sentinel states, heavily armed, aimed at China, advanced precision weapons, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, New Zealand, Australia. India is kind of a reluctant partner, not really participating. The idea is to try to prevent what's called Chinese aggression. What's Chinese aggression? Well, it's not off the coast of California. There are confrontations off the border of China. But the main Chinese aggression is its development, which cannot be contained by military force. Now there's another conflict developing in Europe, Putin's invasion of Ukraine. In the short term, at least, gave the United States a wonderful shot in the arm, great gift. It pushed Europe into the U.S. pocket. Now, there has been a background conflict since the end of the Second World War about whether Europe would be essentially a satellite of the United States within the NATO framework, the Atlanticist framework, or whether Europe would move on an independent course, become what was called a third force in international affairs, along lines sketched by de Gaulle, Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, Gorbachev's proposals for a European common home from Lisbon to Vladivostok with no military alliances. That was another option. Well, for the short term, at least, that's been blocked by Putin's invasion, which handed Europe over to the United States on a silver platter. Best gift he could have given Washington's imperial pretenses. Whether this could last is very much an open question, because it's not at all clear that Europe can really survive in any great viable way if it breaks from Russia and Eurasia. Notice that Russia is the barrier between Europe and the Eurasian landmass that China is developing so extensively, bringing in the East Asian economies. The U.S. is, if you look at it in what are called geopolitical terms, the U.S. now is kind of an exaggerated case of what England was for centuries. England was an island off the coast of Europe, and its main strategies were to try to keep Europe from becoming unified. The United States is now kind of an island off the coast of Eurasia, and its goals are to keep it from becoming unified. That means incorporating.
Noam Chomsky's critique of the contemporary state of the United States presents a compelling and sobering analysis of a nation grappling with deep-seated internal fractures. His discussion delves into the nation's social and economic divisions, its declining political functionality, and its increasing reliance on military power as its global influence wanes. In his conversation, Chomsky highlights how the internal dysfunction of the United States is exacerbating its decline on the world stage, arguing that instead of addressing domestic issues through constructive policies, the government, particularly the Republican Party, is obstructing progress in favor of political gain. Additionally, Chomsky underscores the growing authoritarian tendencies within the U.S., particularly in reference to the Trump administration's attempt to dismantle the civil service system and replace it with ideological loyalists. This analysis explores Chomsky's argument in depth, contextualizing his insights within broader historical, economic, and geopolitical frameworks, internal divisions, and political dysfunction. Chomsky's discussion begins with an examination of the deepening internal fractures within the United States, which are manifesting in social, economic, and political turmoil. He observes that Congress has become increasingly dysfunctional, not as a result of systemic inefficiencies, but due to the deliberate obstructionism of the Republican Party. He asserts that the GOP's explicit strategy is to block all legislative progress to ensure that the Democratic Party appears ineffective, thereby increasing their chances of reclaiming power. This political brinkmanship creates a self-reinforcing cycle of dysfunction, where legislative stalemates are blamed on the ruling party, while the obstructing party benefits from public dissatisfaction. Historically, such internal dysfunction has been observed in declining empires. The late stages of the Roman Empire, for example, saw intense political infighting that hindered effective governance. leading to economic and military deterioration. Similarly, Chomsky's critique aligns with studies of imperial overstretch, where the United States continues to project power abroad while its domestic foundations weaken. The failure to pass critical infrastructure legislation, despite glaring needs such as crumbling roads and outdated power grids, exemplifies how political stagnation is impeding national progress. Furthermore, the notion that a major political party actively works against governance for partisan advantage is deeply troubling. This strategy prioritizes power over public well-being and contributes to growing disillusionment among the electorate. As a result, democratic institutions erode, paving the way for extremist elements to gain influence, an issue Chomsky highlights when discussing Trump's authoritarian ambitions. Let's watch the rest of his interview with Professor Richard Wolff, then we will be back with the critical analysis.
Self apart from within in the social divisions and class divisions and all the other fighting and splitting of the society apart. And then all it has to hold on to its empire is the military. It doesn't look really good for the United States to be falling apart inside and having to rely on military in the face of the Chinese and other economic powerhouse that outgrows the United States and has been doing that for 30 years. It does look like this is an effort to stop something that has very little chance of success.
Well, it's very interesting to see how in the internally dysfunctional United States, this problem is being faced. So it's commonly observed that Congress is dysfunctional, can't do anything. That's a curious way of saying that the Republican Party has simply gone off the rails. They're not a parliamentary party in any traditional sense. Their policy is very explicit. McConnell announces it, is just block everything. Make sure that the country will be harmed as much as possible, so it will be blamed on the Democrats and we can retake power. It's quite open. He says it in almost those words. So the GOP blocks everything in Congress. But they accepted one thing, a China Competition Act. The United States is, U.S. infrastructure is falling apart. The bridges are collapsing. The electric grid doesn't work. There's a sharp cutback in development. There's a huge shortage of chips because they're not producing chips here. So what can we do about it? Well, one possibility would be to pass legislation to carry, as during the Second World War or the First War period, with massive government intervention to develop the economy. Can't do that. So therefore, they passed a China Competition Act. We can rebuild our roads and bridges to compete with China. It's the only way it could get through. The only way the GOP would allow it to go through is a China Competition Act. Well, of course, it's symbolic of the internal destruction and disorder. We incidentally just today, learned something new about it. There's a new report that came out, which people should look at, from Axios, which is usually fairly reliable. It's a description of something that kind of slipped under the radar in the last days of the Trump years. Right before Trump left office, he had a directive establishing what was called Schedule F for civil servants, a plan to essentially remove the entire civil service system, at least the leading elements of it, and to replace them by Trump loyalists. The civil service bureaucracy has traditionally been basically nonpartisan, just keeps functioning, whoever's in office. But this was an effort to change it radically, to make sure that the leading elements are Trump loyalists, and they will run what's left of the government as an organization beholden to the ultimate leader. There's a name for that. That's outright fascism, not proto-fascism. Well, when Biden came in, he rescinded the order, but the Republicans are probably coming back. And there's now debate in Congress about what to do about it. House passed a resolution calling for legislation to block it. Senate's not going to accept it. GOP won't accept that because they want it to come back in.
Professor Chomsky, I wish we had much more time. I would like to thank you very, very much. And to my audience, what can I say? This is a very unusual opportunity to hear somebody explain what has been happening to us and what we face as we go forward. And as always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.
One of the most telling examples of how US policymakers navigate their internal dysfunction is the passage of the China Competition Act. Chomsky explains that the only way Republicans would support legislation addressing infrastructure was to frame it as a measure to compete with China. This reveals a fundamental flaw in how the US government approaches economic and technological development. It is motivated by geopolitical rivalry rather than a genuine commitment to domestic improvement. This approach echoes Cold War-era policymaking, where investments in science, technology, and infrastructure were often justified as necessary to counter Soviet advancements. While the space race led to numerous scientific breakthroughs, the underlying motivation was not national progress, but strategic competition. Today, a similar mentality dominates policymaking. Instead of addressing issues such as economic inequality, healthcare, and education on their own merit, they are only given attention when framed as measures to combat a foreign adversary. This pattern is unsustainable in the long term. China, for instance, has been investing heavily in domestic infrastructure, clean energy, and technological advancements with a clear vision of long-term growth. The US, by contrast, remains reactive rather than proactive. If meaningful progress can only occur under the pretext of geopolitical competition, then the country will continue to lag behind nations that have coherent and forward-thinking strategies for economic development. The threat of authoritarianism, perhaps the most alarming aspect of Chomsky's discussion, is his revelation of the Trump administration's attempt to transform the US civil service into a system dominated by ideological loyalists. The implementation of Schedule F, which aimed to purge nonpartisan civil servants and replace them with Trump loyalists, represents a fundamental assault on democratic governance. As Chomsky notes, this move is not merely an example of political maneuvering, it is outright fascism. Throughout history, authoritarian regimes have relied on purging bureaucratic institutions of independent voices in favor of party loyalists. This tactic was employed by figures such as Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, who dismantled professional governance structures to consolidate control. The civil service traditionally serves as the backbone of a stable democracy, ensuring continuity of government functions regardless of political transitions. By attempting to dismantle this system, Trump sought to undermine institutional checks and balances, making government agencies subservient to executive authority. Although President Biden rescinded this order, Chomsky warns that the Republican Party has not abandoned this strategy. With Trump's continued influence over the GOP and the possibility of a future Republican administration instating such policies, the threat of authoritarianism remains an urgent concern. The fact that Congress remains divided on how to prevent such measures from returning indicates that democratic norms are increasingly under siege. The broader implications of US decline. Chomsky's overarching argument suggests that the decline of the US is not solely a result of external competition, but is driven primarily by internal decay. The combination of political dysfunction, misplaced economic priorities, and creeping authoritarianism creates a scenario where the US is incapable of effectively addressing its problems. History provides numerous lessons about the dangers of internal collapse. The fall of great powers is often preceded by internal disunity and the prioritization of short-term political gains over long-term stability. The British Empire, for instance, crumbled not only due to external pressures, but also because of domestic economic struggles and political fragmentation. The same can be said for the Soviet Union, where internal inefficiencies and political corruption hastened its downfall. If the US continues down this path, it risks reaching a point of irreversible decline. Military power alone cannot sustain an empire. Economic strength, social cohesion, and political stability are equally crucial. The over-reliance on military might, coupled with the erosion of democratic norms, suggests that the US is facing a precarious future. Conclusion: Noam Chomsky's critique serves as a stark warning about the trajectory of the United States. His insights reveal a nation that is not only failing to address its domestic problems, but is actively exacerbating them through political obstructionism, short-sighted policy-making, and increasing authoritarian tendencies. While external competition from China and other rising powers is often cited as a primary concern, the real threat lies within an internal decay that, if left unchecked, could lead to the nation's decline as a global superpower. The lessons of history make it clear that great powers do not fall solely due to external threats, but because of their own internal failings. The United States must confront these realities if it hopes to maintain its influence and avoid the fate of past empires. Chomsky's analysis, while bleak, serves as a crucial call to action, one that demands attention before it is too late. This conversation about power, political decay, and economic competition is more relevant than ever. If you found this breakdown thought-provoking, make sure to like this video so more people can engage with these critical ideas. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the US can reverse its internal decline? Or are we witnessing an irreversible shift in global power? And if you want to stay informed and continue dissecting these important issues with us, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's so much more to explore, and I'd love to have you as part of the conversation.